So pillar one is looking at market depth, so how deep and liquid are financial markets in Africa. So you have South Africa and Nigeria doing very well there. Nigeria especially has implemented some policies to improve market access. I'll move on to that in the next slide. But you can see that it's one of the pillars where there is quite a bit of gap between the first and the second country and the rest. There is quite a big cluster in the middle. When we look at the pillars overall, pillar 3 tends to be the one that does best, and pillar 5, where countries do tend to perform well, and then pillar 4, which is the capacity of local investors, tends to be the one that is most challenging for most countries on the index. But pillar 1, we have a fairly big cluster in the middle. Looking at how countries change from last year to another, to this year, there were some changes in terms of policy. So some countries were lowering barriers to enable new companies to enter the stock exchange. There was also some innovation in terms of bringing new products. In the case of Ghana, for example, introducing the real estate investment trusts. There was also innovation in terms of the way participants were allowed to access the market. So, for example, the online trading platforms that Nigeria introduced. And we can see the biggest risers as well being Ghana, Nigeria, and Zambia. On the other hand, you had some negative developments as well. Some countries trying to implement policies that they thought would help the market, but it's also about finding the right timing and understanding what may be the unintended consequences of some policies in some cases. So in the case of Tanzania, for example, requiring these companies to list on the local stock exchange and float their shares to local investors, but when you don't have enough take-up by the local investors, this kind of policy can fail. So some examples of what we saw happening over the last year. Pillar 2 is looking at the access to foreign exchange. So what are the factors that determine foreign investors' capacity and ability to deploy and repatriate capital into a market? Because it might be very well that Ethiopia is the fastest growing economy, but if you're a foreign investor and you want to invest, there is no stock exchange, there's only a commodity exchange, for example. Or if there is the opportunity to invest in a foreign market, but the foreign exchange has multiple rates, one that you see and one that is different, then that can also be an obstacle. Capital controls as well, some countries that still have high capital controls, or exchange rate regimes that do not encourage foreign investment can also be an issue. So these are the things that we look at in this second pillar, as well as the liquidity, so the interbank foreign exchange turnover, and also the ratio of portfolio flows to reserves. So South Africa, for example, was the top country in this pillar before. Now Kenya overtook it and is ranking first, which was one of the interesting findings of this year's results. But it highlights the vulnerability that sometimes open capital markets bring. We saw what happened in South Africa in the summer. It is one of the most liquid emerging markets globally. So when you're so open to foreign capital and foreign investment, that can also be a challenge when suddenly you have capital outflows and the willingness of investors to be in the market reverses. So there needs to be a balance with central banks and other policymakers preparing for that event through building foreign exchange reserves, for example, at the central bank. So that's very important, how you balance the opening of the capital markets without making the market vulnerable to sudden outflows or investment reversals. And that's something that we saw a lot of survey participants highlight as well when we talked to them about that. But they all generally agreed that yes, there are risks with opening to foreign investment, but at the same time, it is necessary for the long term to do so, and you cannot develop until you do. So even though there are risks, there are vulnerabilities that this brings, it is very important that we set the right infrastructure to be able to allow investors to come from abroad. So here we saw some policies that countries introduced in terms of opening up their capital markets. So a few countries moved to liberalize their exchange rate regimes, for example, moving from fixed exchange rate regimes to floating ones. In some cases, as you see with Egypt, that can lead to sudden movements in inflation or on the exchange rate, which can lead to short-term vulnerabilities in the economy. But in the longer term, capital markets help create more stable financial conditions. At the same time, in terms of reporting of exchange rates, Ivory Coast and Ethiopia moved towards single exchange rates, boosting the element of transparency. And looking at the top risers, we had Seychelles, Kenya, and Zambia, who helped liberalize and open their capital markets the most. The third pillar looks at the market transparency, tax and regulatory environment. Again, interesting results here. Nigeria overtaking South Africa due to a number of policies that they've implemented to harmonize the tax rates and also bring more tax transparency. But overall here you see that it's a pillar where a lot of countries do fairly well. If you think how the pillar 2 and pillar 1 were looking, this is one where we generally tend to have high scores. And there tends to be not as much variation. You have some countries that are lagging behind, but even Ethiopia is doing better here than it's doing in other pillars. And looking at the risers and fallers and the policies that were introduced over the last year, so we have Ghana, Nigeria, Ivory Coast improving, some countries moving from permitted but not required to required in terms of the IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards with Ivory Coast and Mozambique. Also in the case of Basel implementation, some countries moving from Basel I to Basel II to Basel III, so there is progress there, but there's still some countries that are lagging behind.